Oh, hey, am I? Check.
Yeah, no, that's better. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This afternoon is my pleasure to be introducing Rick Hess, who I've known, how long have I known you? Like probably, I mean, technically we met in grad school, but neither of us really remember that. So, right. Since like the early 2000s. But just a few things. First, Rick really likes long introductions, so I will keep it short for him. He is the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And just a few little notes about Rick that I think are for at least me, interesting. So his dissertation was made into a book called Spinning Wheels, where he shows in a very kind of cool way sort of why districts will never be able to really successfully reform themselves because of the politics involved. Nevertheless, he spent the next 20 years trying to figure out how to help folks get better. Second is just sort of more SDP focused, is sort of back in 2000, sort of 7, 8 or sometime around then, we wrote an article together called The Numbers We Need about sort of different sort of connecting data systems within agencies. And in a way that was kind of at the beginning of the sort of vision of what SDP was and could be. So he was actually sort of helping think about that. Anyway, Rick's latest book is called Letters to a Young Education Reformer, which is a sort of great read, although I have to admit I felt a little bit left out by the title. So, oh well. But many of you will be sort of more directly impacted by it. But with that, I just want to turn it over to Rick. We'll talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions after that. Rick.
Hey, thanks, man. Hey, it's great to be here with you guys today. John was, about 4 years ahead of me in grad school at Harvard. This was a quarter century ago. So we are definitely no longer young anything, but it's just, we got to own it. I've been doing this stuff. I wrote this book, Letters to a Young Education Reformer. Started this book a couple years ago. What had struck me is I've been doing this stuff since I started substitute teaching for pizza money in Waltham, Massachusetts, a couple miles down the road, when I was an undergrad back in the late 1980s. So I've been doing this stuff now pushing on 30 years. And as I was watching really well-intentioned reform efforts come apart again, I was wondering why this all felt so familiar. And this book was an attempt to share some of the stuff I think I've learned over time with folks who are trying to solve these critical problems today. Now, I could take you through the 21 letters blow by blow, but that would be cruel and unusual punishment. So instead, let me start with this. It was back in 2002. I'm in my office at AEI, this DC think tank. I get a call from the Pentagon, and the guy says, Rick, we'd like you to come over to the Pentagon. Can't tell you what it's about. As soon as you get here, we need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I said, I'm there, right? Who's not going to go for that meeting? So I go over, and it turns out the U.S. is planning to invade Iraq. They're planning to support the ministries of the government after the invasion, and they need teams to help support the ministries. And they want me to be one of the 4 people who's going to help the education ministry. I was, interested, flattered, all that stuff. So we have a couple of these meetings. There's about 4 members of us who would be going over to support the ministry. A couple of folks from the Pentagon running the briefings. A couple of folks from the administration. There is a moment from this. I only wound up going for about 2 of these meetings, and then I was like, this isn't for me. But there's a moment that's always stuck with me. Very nice young woman from the executive branch, from the White House, puts her hands on the table and she said, this all sounds terrific. We're so excited about what you all are thinking about doing. Just the one real priority for the president is making sure that when we leave Iraq, they've got their own version of No Child Left Behind. We didn't know how many buildings were going to still be standing after an invasion. We didn't know how many kids were going to be dispossessed or injured. They didn't know I was Jewish, and they wanted me to advise the Ministry of Ed in Iraq. But we knew that NCLB was what they wanted to do. And the reason this has stuck with me is not because this is particularly unusual, it's because it feels so typical of decades of education reform. It's this habit we have of really passionate, well-meaning people getting an education because they want to make a difference, looking for something that's going to really change the lives for lots of children, something that will make a huge impact, and then grabbing onto it and trying to take it to as many kids in as many places as fast as humanly possible. In the book, I call this Big R reform. Common Core, small high schools, no child left behind, race to the top. These big capital letter, Big R reforms that we can get excited about. Problem is, it turns out that I don't actually think these things tend to pay off. And I think they tend not to pay off because they don't actually do a very good job of understanding how schools work, how school systems operate, or how you actually drive educational change that does the things we want to do. So make sure you hear me here. I'm not suggesting ill intentions on anybody's part. I'm not suggesting these reforms are misguided. I am suggesting that how you do these things matters immensely. And we often do them wrong, not because we don't mean well, but because we're so excited to make a difference that we do it wrong. So let me thumbtack that for a second. Let me just say this. Look, most people in my experience, especially nowadays, are involved in education reform not necessarily because they're all that interested in changing schools and classrooms. I meet a remarkable number of people who are involved in education reform because they're worried about social inequality, because they're worried about poverty, because they're worried about economic justice, and they see schools as a lever they can use to make this a better world. And that's cool. I got respect for that. I'm not arguing with that. What I am suggesting is when you think about schooling and school reform that way, it's easy to wind up with blind spots. Here, in the spirit of full disclosure, let me be real clear that I have never approached school reform because I think it is a great lever to fix America or fix the world. I got involved in school reform for really petty reasons. I hated school when I was a kid. I was bored senseless. I resented the time I spent. I found and I'm not just talking because, you know, the getting bullied and the beat up, right? A lot of us have been there. But I am talking nothing worse than knowing you have to wake up at 7 a.m. to go sit in some place where all you want to do is watch the minute hand tick around the clock for the next 7 hours. And the idea that this is just taken for granted, even in good school systems, struck me as bizarre. And what made it doubly frustrating for me was the fact that it wasn't like that every minute of every day. Just like all of us, I had some of those teachers where it was totally otherwise. For me, the one that always comes to mind was my 6th grade teacher, Selma Ziff in Pine Ridge Elementary, right? Where she had a whole classroom of 6th graders, you know, excited to argue probabilities at the lunch table because she turned our room into, you know, a casino for a week and a half to learn probability. And so we're running roulette on M&Ms and kids are arguing over lunch, the permutations. We've all seen classrooms like that. And then the next year, I'm back in 7th grade and I hated everything about math all over again. And I just couldn't understand why this would be. Because it just seems to me a terrible way to treat kids. It seems to me a pointless way to spend billions of dollars. And it seems to me a lost opportunity to actually equip kids to have the lives we want them to have. So when I wound up, I started substitute teaching when I was in college. And I thought, you know what, this is neat, I want to teach. So I went down to East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. And I was like, what, I want to try to do for these kids what Ziff did for me. And I failed, but you know, it's hard to do that. There's no great shame. The thing that struck me most was I failed, most of it's on me, right? When we fail, it's on us. But I also was struck that the school and the school system were not set up in a way to make it easier for me to succeed. I was hired to start the 3rd AP economics class in the state of Louisiana, but then they stuck me in a middle school. Didn't make a lot of sense. But then 2 days before school began, they moved me back to a high school. But by then it was actually too late to prep or to run the AP economics. I wanted to actually get to know my kids, kind of connect with them, figure out what interested them. Except I'm teaching 160 kids a day. I want to give them writing because kids in East Baton Rouge Parish hardly ever wrote. And I wasn't quite quick enough to do the math that if you're giving kids 8 to 10 page papers once a quarter to 160 kids, you don't actually get to leave your apartment until mid-July. We actually learn as teachers not to go ahead and do things because it is so frustrating to actually try to do them well. I walked away from East Baton Rouge Parish after 2 years saying, look, I don't understand how so many well-intentioned people can live in such a frustrating system. I went back up to Harvard to do my PhD where I met Johnny. And the thing I wanted to understand was how come the school reform agenda that was getting talked about in East Baton Rouge had nothing to do with the things that frustrated me as a teacher? What explained that disconnect? I was trying to study, I wanted to understand why did some places adopt some reforms and not others. So I talked to the National Science Foundation agreed to fund me to do this research. As John mentioned, I was trying to understand why across 57 urban districts they adopted some reforms and not others. And it turned out I couldn't do this study I wanted to do, which is not great when you're taking federal government money. And I couldn't do it because every district was doing everything. Across the 57 districts, the average district was launching 11 major reforms a year over the 3 years I looked at. Excuse me, 11 major reforms over the 3 years I looked at. That's a reform every 3 months. This was at a time period in the mid-90s when all you used to hear was we got to shake up urban education. I don't care what kind of organization you're in, school system or anything else. When you're rolling out a major new reform every 3 months, there's only one rational response. You close your door and you tell your neighbor, this too shall pass. And so we have taught people in school systems that reform is something that piddles off the roof. It's a pitter-patter on the tin roof of the schoolhouse, and they wait it out. And now each new superintendent isn't cynical because they know that they're really serious about this new agenda, but they forget that they're speaking to a room full of people who've said, we've heard this all before. What we have managed to do through this endless pursuit of reform is actually two things. One, we've managed to ensure from a practitioner perspective that none of it gets taken seriously. Because if you take it seriously, you spend half your summer actually working on the new math curriculum, designing scope and sequence, planning lessons. You get to do these for 18 months, then there's new leadership in the district, or you get a new grant, and you never get those 5 weeks back. So once a teacher's been through this once or twice, they no longer buy in, and they tell the newbies on the staff, you've got to be a sucker to actually believe this thing. And that brings us to the second thing that happens, which is, you know how we worry about when doctors overprescribe antibiotics because we create these drug-resistant superinflus? We have created reform-resistant schools. We have injected so much reform with so frequently, with so little follow-through, that we have taught everybody not to actually take our reform seriously. And so what happens then as a reformer, you say, no, I don't care what happened over the last 5 years, the last decade, this time it's different. And the educators still kind of close their door and try to wait it out. And so reformers say, you know what, we are going to drive through into these schools until you guys take it seriously. And then the educators say, well, wait a minute, now you guys are just attacking us. We're just being reasonable, and you're attacking us as not caring about kids because we don't get it. We get it. You're just engaging in political posturing. And now the reformers feel insulted, and so they say, well, now we're really going to double down, and we're going to... And you wind up with something that feels like a war on teachers, and you wind up with something that feels like the debate about school reform in the U.S. today. So what do you do about any of this? How do you get out of this? So, again, I'm not going to walk you through everything in the book, but let me talk about 5 things I think I've learned over time. 1, I've learned that we've got to do infinitely better at rebuilding the relationship between talkers and doers. Talkers are people who talk about stuff. They're people at universities and think tanks and legislative bodies and advocacy groups who get to run around and talk. Doers are the people who are actually in schools and classrooms, who actually do the work. The nice thing about being a doer is you have a very fine-grained view of what's happening. You see individual students. You see how teacher evaluation is actually implemented on the ground. You see the practical consequences of decisions. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is not to get all gooey about doers, because doers also have huge blind spots. They tend to get myopic. when you were in one school every day, 190 days a year, you think the whole world is like your school. You tend to get very defensive. When somebody says we can do this differently or better, you hear them saying that you're not doing your job well. That's where talkers can be invaluable. Talkers have the opportunity to see lots of schools, to read long, boring white papers, to analyze performance patterns. So there's lots of room for a healthy relationship between talkers and doers. But here's where I fear we've gotten ourselves in trouble. Of the last, say, decade or so, I feel like we've watched the professionalization of school reform. You can start counting, without much difficulty, a dozen organizations today that are just in the education reform business. They're all talkers all the time. And these are the guys who get to write op-eds, and we get to go on radio, and we get to be on TV, and we get to fly to cool conferences of smart people and stand up here and they'll listen to us politely. And it's very easy to get full of yourself. And you start thinking, it's about us and our smart ideas, and those doers, they're just these parochial folks who don't quite get it, who need to get with the program. And when they don't get with the program, we say they're not putting the kids first. And that's a problem. Second thing I've learned is that policy is a much more limited tool than we'd like it to be. Policy is really good at two kinds of things. It's good at telling people what they must do and telling people what they must not do. So, if your goal is to make a school system build a new school, policy's great. If your goal is to make sure there's no more than 24 kids in a classroom, policy's great. Unfortunately, most of what we talk about today as school reform is stuff like teacher evaluation, school turnarounds, accountability, performance-based accountability systems. When it comes to this stuff, what matters is much more how you do it than whether you do it. And the trick is when we get caught up in the policy pursuit, it's easy to become blind to the how we're doing it. Take, for example, right, the teacher evaluation stuff that we've all been living through for the last decade. Close to 10 years ago, New Teacher Project did a really useful paper built around one page with 8 pie charts, which told us what we all should have known, but people managed to blot out from their mind, which is that in school district after school district, 99% of teachers are rated effective, even when nobody thought that was true. People said, well, we ought to do something about this. So the Obama administration put it in Race to the Top. It got stuck in NCLB waivers. 30-odd states went ahead and ran at this stuff. Colorado kind of kicking it off with Senate Bill 191. Enormous amounts of energy, huge political fights, lots of money, lots of rooms of smart people arguing about the best way to build student learning objectives. And, you know, earlier this year, Colorado reported that after 7 years of assiduous, careful work by smart people on Senate Bill 191, 1% of teachers are rated ineffective. This is actually the case almost nationally. Outside of a couple places like DCPS in New Mexico, you find that about 98% of teachers are rated effective in states even after all of this. Brown University's Matt Kraft did a nice paper on this last year where he looked at why, and it turns out it's really complicated stuff. Principals don't want to be mean. Principals are worried that if they give negative evaluations, teachers still won't get moved out, so now they just got an angry teacher in the back of the teacher's lounge. Nobody knows how to build a meaningful student learning objective. So it's not that the big R idea was wrong or bad, it's that we all treated that as what mattered, and the whole thing wound up breeding cynicism and frustration and wasting enormous time and energy for remarkably little payoff. Now, when our big ideas don't pay off, what we do, us talkers have a very thoughtful response, which is we say it's an implementation problem. It's an implementation problem means, well, we didn't actually know what the hell we were talking about, and it's the doers' fault. And so then the doers say, wait a minute, you guys are scapegoating us again. This is part of your war on teachers, and the whole thing builds. Third thing I've learned. expertise needs to be used much more carefully than we usually use it. Now, don't hear me wrong. I mean, especially, you guys, Jed fellows. This is not like some Trump-era anti-expert. But look, I'm a big believer in expertise when I go to the dentist. I want somebody who knows, who's deeply skilled at reading an x-ray, at identifying a cavity, at wielding a drill. If I'm taking one of my boys for a special ed diagnostic, I want somebody who's, expert at both the diagnosis and prescribing intervention. But think how different that is, a specific skill set applied to an identifiable challenge. Think how different that is from, say, the teacher evaluation stuff that we just talked about. In teacher evaluation stuff, there were actually lots of kinds of expertise on the table. There's the need to design assessments that are valid and reliable. There's the need to design how do you use these assessments to measure individual educators in psychometrically defensible ways. There's the expertise of designing student learning objectives. There's the expertise of doing Danielson protocol, observational protocol, and of doing the Marzano observational protocol. There's the expertise of training people. By the time you start thinking about stuff like accountability, Common Core, teacher evaluation, site-based, it turns out that it's not an expertise, it's a dozen expertises. It's 24. But what happens is when we get excited, we want to be able to say, look, this stuff is expertly derived, we know what we're doing. And as soon as governors or presidents or superintendents start talking this way, a whole bunch of experts, academics and consultants and vendors start circling, plying their wares, talking about all the expertise they have to share. And somebody wins this game of musical chairs, and they get to become the go-to for this expert-derived intervention. And then they know 5 or 8% of what's going on, and they make up the other 92% as it goes along, but we say it was run by experts. The point is not an anti-expert rant. The point is that we, as consumers of expertise, need to be much more thoughtful and deliberate about what we think experts can do to be helpful. Let me put it this way. Years ago, I was over in South Korea for the State Department. I spent about a week and a half traveling the country. I was speaking to like colleges and school leader groups. And at some point we did a press thing at the Ministry of Ed. And they got me up there as the American expert on education. And they're like, as an American expert on higher education, what lessons do you have for South Korea? I know nothing about South Korean higher education. I mean, literally nothing. But you don't say that because you're an expert and it's fun to hear yourself talk. So I start rambling and I finally stumble upon a thought. And I'm like, well, in the US, we have this great geographic dispersion of institutions of higher ed. We have thousands of institutions across the land, and they are hubs of talent development and economic blah, blah, blah. And in South Korea, pretty much everything's clustered in Seoul, and you guys ought to rethink this. So I go back to the hotel. Next morning, my translator kind of greets me at the door. She's holding the paper, the main paper, whatever it is. It's open to like page 5. There's my mugshot and an article in Korean, and I'm like, what's up? She's like, we have to go back to the ministry. I'm like, what happened? Well, because I know nothing about South Korean higher ed, I didn't realize that they had released like their 10-year strategic plan like 10 years previously. The 10-year strategic plan like 6 months previously. And of course, it called for all their investments being made in Seoul-based colleges and universities, because that's where pretty much everything is. And so the whole story was American higher ed expert blasts South Korean Ministry of Ed for a stupid higher ed plan. So we went back, and I managed to smooth over an international incident with an ally over higher ed strategy papers. But the funny thing was, the point of the story is in the back of the car, while they're driving me over to the ministry to do my mea culpas, you know what's going through my head? I'm sitting there thinking, this is a damn good idea. I'll apologize, but they really should do that. I don't know anything about South Korea, and I've only had this thought for 12 hours, but I am now deeply invested in it. And we've all been there. You've all been there at a meeting where you're like, well, what if we try this? And a week later, you've decided this is the answer. Now imagine what happens if you have spent a year of your life studying differentiated instruction, or 5 years studying site-based management, and suddenly it's on the agenda, and somebody opens the door and lets you kind of, you're not an unbiased expert carefully thinking through the ups and downs. You are a kid in a candy store. And these are the people we look to as our experts to hold our hand. All right, fourth thing I've learned. History matters. Not in like the prosaic way, like if you don't know history, you're doing repeated stuff, but much more fundamentally. Years ago, back in 2000, I wrote a paper for the Progressive Policy Institute called Tear Down This Wall. It was on teacher licensure, and the argument was that it didn't make a lot of sense to license teaching the way we do, that a better model is to look to fields like journalism or business management, where the skills are complex and personal dependent, where it's a big plus to get a degree, but you're allowed to apply for a job without one. It caused a lot of waves, like Secretary of Ed, Rod Page, was waving it around, and yada yada, spoke at the White House. And it was really controversial. And especially I was teaching in a school of education at the time at the University of Virginia. And a lot of my colleagues in schools of education and teacher preparation thought it was a terrible idea and thought it was crazy that I would propose it. And I spent about 6 months going around the country and having conversations where nothing productive was said. They would ask, I would speak my piece, and they would ask why I was such a terrible person, and I would get defensive and, cry. But at some point, I stumbled upon this crazy notion of actually explaining what I was thinking about, why I thought this was a good idea. And I said, look, we started licensing teachers in the US back in the 1830s and 1840s for a simple reason. Horace Mann was trying to build out these common schools in Massachusetts. At the time, teaching was a male-dominated profession. If they were going to get enough bodies to fill up these new common schools, they needed cheaper, more predictable labor, so they were going to let women do it. But they didn't trust women around other people's kids outside the home. So in order to get women to take these jobs where they would pay them 1/3 what they paid men, they were going to make sure men trained these women in the norms of interacting with other people's kids. They called these normal schools, right? The proud birth of America's teacher colleges. And I said, look, I don't want to relitigate what Horace Mann did in the 1830s. I am just telling you, I don't think that model's necessarily a big value add for attracting and recruiting and keeping great teachers in 2017 and in the 21st century. And what was fascinating was you would think people would be more offended, especially by the snarky spin I tend to put on Horace Mann's history. But what happened was we would now be in a debate about what had really changed about America's teacher labor markets. Why do people go into teaching? How do you attract them? What does a teaching career mean? And now we were actually talking about substance, and we were agreeing and disagreeing on specific points rather than just this top level, Fox News, MSNBC shouting match debate. And for me, that was just a powerful insight that, look, we tend to talk about school improvement as if schools are failing and we have to come from the outside to make them do better, which is the craziest thing I ever heard of. We've been doing public education in what's now the US in some form or other since Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. The schools that we built, that we established, that we filled with teachers in the 1800s and the early 1900s were not designed to do what we're asking them to do today. So we're putting teachers in schools that weren't designed for what we want to do. We've got teachers in positions that aren't necessarily well conceived for today's labor market. And when these things don't work out, instead of saying, how do we imagine better, we say, you're not doing your job. And the funny thing is, if you actually say, look, the challenge here is how do we create schools that do what we want them today, you're suddenly inviting in everybody from all sides of this divide. We're still going to disagree. Some people are going to want tenure, and others of us think tenure needs to be fundamentally reshaped. But now we're having a conversation about how you do things rather than who's the villain. Look, fifth and final thing I've learned is real simple. Passion is a double-edged sword. Education is filled with passionate people who want to make the world a better place. And honestly, that is a wonderful problem to have, right? Infinitely better problem to have than, like, I don't know, trying to improve the caliber of airline customer service, where nobody seems to give a damn, right? But the problem when people are passionate, Harvard's football coach, Tim Murphy, who's won 8 Ivy League football titles, which is more or less impressive depending how hard you think it is to win an Ivy League football title. But But Tim Murphy has said, look, you can only do this work if you're running 100 miles an hour with your hair on fire. And right, that's true of so many great educators and great kind of education champions and reformers. But when you're running 100 miles an hour with your hair on fire, you tend to have certain blind spots. You tend not to see the curb you just tripped over. You tend not to see the wall in front of you. You tend not to know where you misstepped. And that's a real problem, that we're not always as thoughtful. So let me put it this way. There's a parable. You guys know the parable of stone soup? I'll retell it real quick in case somebody doesn't. Back in Revolutionary War, 3 soldiers are heading home from the wars. They're wandering through the winter of New England. They're starving, they're cold. They come upon a village, and they knock on the door, and they say, can you just spare a little bit of food? The villager says, hey, sorry, tough winter, can't help you. Next door, no luck, next door. After about 7 or 8 doors, one of them says, yeah, let me try something different. Knocks on the 9th door, says, hey, can I just borrow a big pot? Guy goes, a pot? Yeah. Lends him his biggest pot. The 3 soldiers carried out to the middle of the square, built a fire under it, fill it with water. One of them goes out to the woods, gets a big stone, good-looking stone, drops it in the pot. One of the villagers they knocked on the door of comes up, says, what's all the commotion? They go, oh, we're making stone soup. Villager goes, stone soup? Well, what's that? They go, oh, it's awesome. You're going to love it. Happy to share it with you. There'll be plenty. Villager goes, well, that's great. They go, just one thing. Stone soup is awesome. It's even better with carrots. Villager goes, oh, I got a dozen carrots. I'm going to go get them. While this is going on, one of the other guys wanders up and says, what's going on? He gets the same spiel. They say, you know, a little celery, some potatoes, venison. 6 hours later, they're all sitting around these heaping bowls of this wonderful soup, and all the villagers agree stone soup is the best thing they've ever had in their life. It wasn't the stone. It was the stone was an excuse to do everything else. Well, this has always felt to me like the parable of education reform. Every school reform ever tried has worked at the pilot site. 8th grade algebra, block scheduling, you name it. And what happens is at the pilot site, it's a pilot site because the principal wants it at their school. The funder who's excited about this gives pilot funding to the pilot site. Whoever dreamed this thing up gives lots of TLC because this is a chance to prove that they know what they're talking about. Usually we wind up doing these things at schools where the principal takes it to the faculty, and it's a faculty that says, yeah, we're excited to be the site. And so that also means there's a Hawthorne effect kicking in. Usually these things wind up being some kind of school of choice, which means parents are in. Oh, and you get an MOU around district policies or the collective bargaining agreement so that you can do it. So it works. And then you take it and you say, aha, we now have the stone that finally produces great soup. And we pick it up and we carry it over to the next district and we drop it down, just a stone, none of the other stuff, and it doesn't work. And we go, implementation problem. It was a great idea, the doers must have screwed it up. So now we're going to force them to do this thing better next time. And what happens is because we're so passionate, because we're so eager to find, for the sake of the kids, the stone that's actually going to work, we never even realize we do this. We do it year after year, time after time. Let me close with this. I used to think that the most important thing when it came to doing the school reform stuff was having good ideas and that people meant really well. The good intentions and good ideas were the ticket. And over the last 25, 30 years, I have come to decide that good ideas and good intentions count for a lot less than I used to think they did. That what matters actually much more is patience, persistence, and wisdom. Hey, with that, let me stop, John.
Well, as usual, not much to think about there. So hopefully we have some questions from the audience. Please ask. And if not, I have actually one. I'll start with that man. Thank you. So you've basically sort of said that the sort of good ideas and passion aren't sort of going to get us where we need to go, but and that sort of the doers and the talkers need to come together more. But how do you say? I mean, give us examples of how that's actually happened, or sort of where actually reform has, and even in sort of a relatively small way, begun to scale.
Yeah. So let me give you 2 examples. Bob Castrell, who some of you know, when I was down in Arkansas a couple couple months back talking about this. He said, Rick, so Massachusetts school reform, 93, is that a big R reform? It was a great question. And I said, after reflection, I said, what's interesting is big R and small R reforms are archetypes. I think big R reforms are only big R reforms when we get all hyped up, get a sugar rush, enact it, and then rush off to kind of focus on free college. That if you do it, if you stick with it, if you make it work, it's not a big R reform. So one, I think when you look at what Massachusetts has been able to do since 93, the bipartisan coalition, the stick-to-itiveness, the fact that folks like Linda Noonan and the Massachusetts Business Alliance have made this number one on their priority list day in, day out for 24 years, that's actually, I'm in favor of doing big, important things, because I think we needed to make some big, important changes, but I'm in favor of doing big, important things carefully and thoughtfully and with patience. And so I think that's one example of it. Another, I think, is just a real nice one is DC impact. That what I think a lot of folks, I wrote this at the time, I don't think people really paid attention, but one of the things folks got wrong when they tried to use DC impact as a model for state teacher evaluation reform is they forgot that in DC, the collective bargaining agreement stipulates that union can't negotiate over the evaluation system, and DC is an SEA. So in each year, as they created that impact system and realized that there were goofy things in the evaluation metrics, realized there were problems looming, realized that it was playing out in ways they didn't intend, it was not that hard for Michelle Rhee and Kaya Henderson and Jason Kamras and their team to go in and aggressively iterate one year to the next. And over the last decade, if you talk to like Jason Kamras, he'll tell you that the way impact plays in DC now is just fundamentally different from what they did then. This is much harder in states where you've got to write the teacher eval bill in the state capitol, and then local school districts are charged with kind of doing this, working back and forth with SEA officials, and then as the purpose changes, as the culture changes, trying to go back to the state capitol and rewrite these things in legislative sessions is a nightmare. So I think two examples, the DC impact and the mass reform bill.
Hi, I'm from Cleveland. I wanted to ask you what advice would you give based on No Child Left Behind as it comes through into ESSA, when we go from switching from one size fits all to every state gets to make their own determinations. Any advice for would-be reformers on making sure that we're keeping academic rigor and accountability, but also moving districts forward in a way that gets the doers to buy in?
Yeah, so two thoughts. One is I've been struck by the amount of enthusiasm for these paper plans states submitted. I remember people didn't pay as much attention as they should have to the Race to the Top applications back in the day. I mean, you had Maya Angelou poems, you had missing pages, it didn't matter, right? It's consultants and state education agency staff working late nights, stapling together lots of paper to make federal officials happy. So one, let's just be careful not to put too much weight, my encouragement would be not to put too much weight on what these plans say, to reserve judgment, to say, look, paper doesn't matter all that much, to focus much more on how these things actually work, on how these things are actually being realized in state systems, even though that's much messier and harder and much less fun for journalists or pundits to write about. And then the second thing would be, look, let's understand what policy can do here. Policy can be a really good lever for telling districts what's got to be reported, what's going to be transparent, what are folks going to focus on. Policy can be a useful way to set the hammer. What is absolutely unacceptable performance? Policy, as much as we wish it were otherwise, turns out to be a terrible lever for actually trying to help with performance-based improvement, with continuous improvement or performance-based management. It's not that those aren't perfectly sensible buzzwords and that these aren't perfectly pleasant ideas. It's just that organizations that do them well, nonprofits, for-profits, even government agencies, they rarely do them well because of policy. They do them well because of the cultures they build, because of the way they approach it. And trying to do this stuff through policy too often can become, at worst, a distraction, and at best can get in the way of people actually doing it. Yeah.
So I read Education Unbound back in, 2011, 12. Loved it at the time. Just super exciting stuff. And then there was kind of the heyday of whole district reform efforts and, New Orleans and the Achievement School District. And, and those seem to kind of adopt some of these principles you talk about. And now it seems like the brakes have kind of been put on that type of whole district reform effort. So I'm wondering if you see that type of movement as something that was just kind of another one of these reforms, or do you still see us going in that type of direction? Just kind of, it seems like there's been a big political pushback to that. So if you could just comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great. So for folks who haven't read Ed Unbound, I did this for ASCD back in like 2010, and one of the points was for me the thing policy is great at is unwinding stuff that's in place, or creating the non-negotiables, right? Policy is good at what you must do and you must not do. So when policy is getting in the way of people creating new solutions, of solving problems, policy is a good way to unwind that. If you want to require everybody has to report how third to eighth graders are doing on reading and math, policy is a powerful lever for making sure we get comparable, transparent data in a way we didn't get before. Those are good uses of policy. The other half of that Unbound was really that when you create space, real solutions, real improvement are a function of human beings stepping into the space and figuring out how to solve stuff, how to attract people, how to encourage people, how to deliver new school models, how to build new tools, right? That schools are this profoundly human organization, and as much as we wish we could come up with systematic push-button solutions, that's just not the nature of educating and raising kids. When it comes to places like say, New Orleans, I think part of what's gone on is obviously, we're all familiar with the community politics there, and some of this is just the way these things unfold. But look, I think the bigger problem is that there's been a lot of good ideas that have been done in clumsy ways. I think good teachers should be paid more than bad teachers. I think it's good to know if teachers are good at their job or not good at their job. I mean, these are ideas that make a lot of sense to me, but if you do them in clumsy ways, you can wind up turning people off rather than winning people over, quite reasonably. And I think what's happened is, I think Indianapolis, for instance, has done its mayoral charters really thoughtfully and well. I think there are a lot of places that have really tried to strike a sensible balance in charter authorizing between being too bureaucratic and giving free pass to schools that are just terrible for kids. I think there are places like DCPS in New Mexico that have done teacher evaluation thoughtfully. But the problem is there are so many places that are doing these things in stupid, destructive, unhelpful ways that I think we see an undertow effect playing out. And that undertow, mostly catalyzed by the absolute ineptitude of the Common Core advocates, has really kind of thrown its arms around all these other things. And so lots of these guys who, if I think we hadn't done so much dumb stuff around them, would be in much stronger positions, find themselves suffering because there's this larger narrative that's not their fault, but that's still going to affect their ability to do their work well. Yeah.
Hi, I'm also from Cleveland, and I am very compelled by the message that you've given, which makes me skeptical of why I'm sold in on it so easily. And I think what I'm hitting on when you were talked about teacher evaluation, and you were talking about just that last thing about people implementing stuff, and there's such a large amount of ineptitude and socially destructive ways that things are going, is in some respects, reform is built out of this urgency that we are not educating students in equitable ways, there's unequitable access. And so when we put policy in place to set the hammer, we are doing it, I think, in the spirit of some people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we can agree that teacher evaluation is a good thing, that access to AP is a good thing. So in my experience in New Jersey, what I heard was, well, how are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to do this? And so I was in a space where I could say, well, this is what the guideline from the state is, let's implement teacher evaluation like this, but how do you reconcile the challenge of policy, which sets the hammer of what is and what is not can be, with LEAs that are just incapable of designing things that are positive and good for students to do the thing that reform was designed to do in the first place?
So it is a wonderful question. So partly, so partly the larger dynamic is because we're aware of how important this stuff is, there is this sense of urgency. But it's funny because I feel like this urgency, this enthusiasm, can just blind us to stuff that we would like totally recognize in like any other aspect of our life. If we were talking about, turning around a Division I football program, something much less important than what we're talking about, and some coach came in and he said, well, we'll worry about blocking and tackling and recruiting and our passing game later. I want to be clear that nothing other than 11-win seasons are acceptable. Those guys actually tend not to be very successful. The folks who tend to be good at this stuff are the folks who focus on the process. How do we get better each day at what we're doing? How do we block better? How do we tackle better? And what happens is if you work the process, over time, that's how you build University of Connecticut women's basketball team. That's how you build, that's how you build the New England Patriots, right? The problem is that feels so unsatisfying, especially in terms of political constraints, that if you're a governor, you got 4 years. If you're a new superintendent and you come in and you say, well, I want to get a feel for the district before I propose grand plans, give me 6 months to really listen. School board's going to be like, see ya. We want somebody who's going to come in and be like, I read Harvard Business Review last month, and I got a 3-point plan. And so what happens is we actually create, not because we don't mean well, but because of how we're wired and how our systems are wired, we create this immense premium on trying to show that we're making a difference the next 18 or 24 months. And the problem is that's just not how real organizational change in places that are really complex, that are really about humans, tend to work. If you were worried about putting up a new skyline in Newark, and you were going to waive a whole bunch of building permit questions, 24 months is actually more executable because the question is, can you actually get those buildings built? You're not worried about habits, routines, talent, this kind of stuff. The district thing is great. Look, so this is the reality. We've got lots of districts where none of us trust the management and the leadership. Problem is, we've also got lots of state systems where I don't trust the management or the leadership, and the U.S. Department of Education, where I'd say the same thing. So we're about done, right? So let me close with this. I did these couple of books the last few years called The Cage Busting Leadership, about how principals and superintendents can do much more to drive change than they think they can. And then teachers kept asking me about it, so I did The Cage Busting Teacher. And the thing that struck me is when you talk to teachers, they will tell you how they are eager to do the right thing. It's just sometimes their families don't support them, and they got these idiot principals who won't let them do what needs to happen to make change. You talk to principals, they'll tell you they're trying to do the right thing. They got these teachers who won't get with the program, and they got this idiot central office that's in their way. You talk to folks in central, they'll tell you they got these principals who aren't with the program, and they got this idiot school board. Part of the problem is we're all the heroes of our own story. And so the folks who think that, folks always think they're doing it right and somebody else is getting in the way. And I don't have any simple answers for that, but I think when we tend to look at this in sweeping notions of who are the good guys, who are the smart guys, who are the right guys, we tend to make it much harder for ourselves to figure out how do we problem solve our ways forward. Guys, thank you so much for letting me be with you today.